Now we'll talk about codes of nonverbal communication. So there are many different codes of nonverbal communication, including vocal expression, which refers to vocalics. This is like referring to the tone or the quality of the voice, the volume, articulation, pitch, rate of speech, and use of silence. I know that's a lot. So let's break those down first. So I want to give an example of me and one of my colleagues who has he teaches in a very loud way that's very amazing. It's awesome, but it conveys a certain um, presence of self-confidence that I think we all strive for, especially in terms of public speaking. Um, then for another example, I might project in a way that is, again, maybe lower, but I might use silence in a way to convey that something is important. So we need to stop and think about it. And also silence as a form of vocalics is a meaningful way to get people's attention. It can be really powerful in certain times, but it's all about how we convey ourselves through our tone, through our vocal expression. You might think about slow and low communication styles. When we speak in a slow way, that might, and I'm a slow speaker, but I also had to, this is like some self-disclosure about me that maybe you don't care about, and that's totally fine. But just to give you a little details, I'm a slow speaker, not because I'm trying to convey anything, but because I also had to go to speech classes as a child because I had a speech impediment. So when I talk quickly, sometimes that still comes out. So I choose to, or I don't choose to, I've been trained to condition to talk slower in order to enunciate and pronounce things correctly. But if we think about someone who talks slower and lower and how we perceive that person comparatively to someone who talks in a high pitch or very quickly, we perceive those two things differently, right? If you think about being in a meeting where someone is speaking very quickly, very high pitched, then there might be some not aggression necessarily, but something feels a little anxious about it. When we talk slow and low, it might be more calming or more not relaxed necessarily, but it might show a different side of like self-confidence. Beyond our use of vocalics as nonverbal communication, we also can think about our appearance. And I spoke to this briefly about what we wear, but I want to talk about those as artifacts. So if you're prepping for a job interview, for example, you strategically pick your outfit and hopefully like the day before at least, right? So if I want to come across as professional, I might wear a blazer with a blouse. But there are certain artifacts. So those are artifacts. Our clothing would be considered artifacts, but there are other artifacts that might be important for me to show too. For example, the choice of wearing makeup or not wearing makeup. Those are artifacts, right? If you wear makeup. Additionally, artifacts can be things like body piercings and tattoos. Do you actively choose to embrace those and express those, or do you cover those up? It depends on the setting sometimes too. And those rules, those communication rules that we talked about earlier, that one would be more of a constitutive rule, right? Then we also have kinesics. That's a hard word for me to say. I'm sorry if I mess it up sometimes. This refers to our body movement, our gestures, our postures, and we need to think about those as they relate to the professional context, because how you talk to your best friend and your body movement with them will be very different than how your body movement is if you are leading a staff meeting, for example. We also have oculesics, which is facial behavior, that eye movement, those facial expressions. And again, think about these in an organizational context or a business context comparatively to your interpersonal relationships. And lastly, we have haptics, which is touch. That's again referring to that those constitutive rules in the workplace. Is it an environment where we hug each other? Is it appropriate to give a high five? Is it inappropriate? What is inappropriate in a workplace? So other ones that I didn't list here, but are in your table in your book and are explored more are to consider are like space and territory and also our environment. So the different qualities of the professional environment. Next, I want to talk a little bit about proxemics and space and get a little bit more into environment. So our space is important. And we can see this in not just an organizational context or an interpersonal context, but in a cultural context too. For example, I am from a rural Appalachian town in Virginia where the proxemic codes, the proxemic rules might be a little bit different than in a city, for example. It might be closer, more collective in nature, whereas we might distance ourselves based on the environment. If we think about what space we use if we're having lunch with a friend or if we're walking by the river with our friends, we might be very close. Whereas if we're in a staff meeting, we might distance ourselves, especially if there is some conflict involved, right? If there's this level of threat and embracing. If we feel a threat by someone else, we'll move away from them. If we feel like we're accepted, then we'll move toward them. And the environment also refers to like lighting and seating arrangements. If you think about fluorescent lights, if you have worked in retail, for example, you might be used to fluorescent lights. And then you might associate fluorescent lights with a uniform in some way. If you think about your classrooms, your not online classrooms, but your in-person classrooms, if you take in-person classes, the seating arrangements, is it a large lecture or a small classroom? It makes a difference. And I can attest to that as an instructor. I very much prefer a smaller classroom compared to a large lecture classroom, because it does seem more familiar. We get to know each other. People feel like they can talk more open dialogue. Whereas in a large lecture, nobody's talking most of the time. So all that said, your exam or your quiz is going over a few of these, but not all of these. Some things to consider: proxemics and environment, and your vocalics, definitely, and appearance. So most of these we'll touch on your quiz, but not all. So keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to stop this and then we'll get into chapter 3.